recording. Okie doke. All right, so the highest voltage a panel can generate under standard test conditions with no load connected to it is referred to as?
Open circuit.
Yeah, the open circuit voltage. So let me reiterate the IV curve, because that's a concept that some people have trouble with. So if this is the IV curve, right, the amps volts curve, and most solar panels, or all solar panels, are going to have an IV curve that looks something like that. And if this is amps, and this is volts, and this is 0, then the maximum amps that panel could ever produce under standard test conditions is going to be the ISC. And the maximum volts it could ever produce is the VOC, volts open circuit. But under either of these scenarios, you're producing 0 watts. This curve here is watts, because watts equals amps times volts. So under ISC conditions or VOC conditions, your panel is producing 0. So that's a bad situation. But somewhere along the curve, and it's usually going to be right here in this bend somewhere, is the maximum power point, or the Pmax. That's where the panel produces the most power, and there will be a voltage associated with that, which is the Vmax, and there will be an amperage associated with that, which will be the Imax. Now, all of these conditions will be given to you, all these numbers will be given to you with the solar panel spec sheet. So it's different with each one, but you'll see a reading that says the ISC for this panel is X number of amps, the Imax or the IMP is X number of amps. The Pmax is just its rating. So if it's a 300 watt panel, this will be 300 watts. And then there's a Vmax and a VOC that's associated. And all those numbers will be given to you with the solar panel. And as conditions change, this curve will change. And temperature affects voltage more than irradiance. So as the temperature increases, this curve might change to something like that. And as the temperature decreases, my drawing is going to be bad, but it's going to go like this. And as irradiance changes, that's going to affect amps. So if a cloud comes out, then the curve might change to this. And all the time, the maximum power point is going to be moving around as these conditions change. And that's what the MPPT does. The maximum power point tracker changes the voltage of your system to track with the maximum power point, so that under any changing condition, your panel is producing the most power it can produce. It will only produce 300 watts under standard test conditions, but it will try to produce whatever the best is under changing conditions. And those changing conditions might actually mean that the panel's producing more watts. Like this one might be 310 watts if it got colder. So that MPPT is very important to switch things around and change things so that you're always operating at the maximum power point. Commonly, a solar panel used in a standalone PV system will be described as a 12 volt or a 24 volt panel. When referenced in this manner, we're talking about the panel's what? Nominal voltage. Yep. I think, Corey, they're leaving it entirely up to you this time. So, yeah, the nominal voltage. So when we say that a battery is 12 volt, it doesn't mean that battery is functioning at 12 volts. It's just its nominal voltage. Usually a 12-volt battery operates anywhere between, say, 11.3 volts and 13.9 volts. So that's going to be somewhere in that range, but we just call it a 12-volt battery. Same thing, 48-volt system is going to be within a range. A solar panel that's operating at nominal 12 volts, its VMP is usually going to be more like 18 volts, but it is compatible with a nominal 12-volt battery. So that's just how we refer to it. It's a shorthand way of referring to things, to know that they're compatible with each other. Which of the following battery types has been known to spontaneously combust when the cell is damaged?
Lithium-ion.
Yeah, this is why the Galaxy 6 phone blows up in your pocket, right? Or those hoverboards all burst into flames when people were driving them or riding them or whatever. Which of the following PV systems will need to incorporate a utility interface?
Grid tied.
Yeah, grid tied. It's the only one that's connected to the utility. So we need to have some way of connecting in or interfacing with the utility. As the temperature of a PV array rises above 25 degrees Celsius, the panel will produce more power, less power. Temperature doesn't affect the ability of a panel to produce power, or automatically disconnect at 35 degrees Celsius.
Less power.
Yep, the hotter it gets, the less power it's going to produce, right? And how much less or more based on temperature is referred to as the temperature coefficient. So, and that temperature coefficient is different for each panel. A disadvantage of saltwater batteries is
Expensive.
yeah, they're expensive compared to the alternatives. There's a company out of Pittsburgh known as Aqueous. They produce these saltwater batteries. The nice thing about them is they're 100% benign. They don't explode, they don't combust, there's no pollutants. So it's all good. They win all sorts of green awards and the like, but they are expensive. Nickel iron batteries are often used in mining operations because they can remain discharged for a long time. They're very expensive. When damaged, they tend to explode, or they're extremely rugged and robust.
Rugged and robust.
Yeah, these things will last forever. Like they will last usually about 30 years. So they are long-lived, they're very rugged, and they can remain discharged, which is a good thing with batteries. Situation where a PV system is generating power to the electrical grid when it is down is known as?
Islanding.
Islanding, right? Just remember that you're basically an island of light in a sea of darkness. And you don't want to be doing that. You don't want to be sending power back onto the grid when the grid is down, because the utility is going to send workers out to work on the power lines. They think there's no power there. You're sending power onto the line, and you could electrocute the worker who's out there working on the system. So your inverter is designed to shut off, disconnect you from the grid as soon as it loses sight of the grid. Which of the following represents the largest diameter wire?
Zero.
Out of those four?
Zero.
Yeah, the smaller the number, the bigger the wire. So 0 gauge is bigger than 2 gauge, is bigger than 6, and the like. And the reason for that, as I understand it, is back when they started making wire, they would start with a stock and then they would feed it through a gauge. And that gauge would reduce the diameter of the wire. And the more gauges that wire or that copper stock ran through, the smaller the wire got. So, you know, I don't imagine they make it that way anymore, but if it went through 12 gauges, it was smaller than 0 gauge. And then it gets weird because the bigger wire, like that you'd hook up to a battery, would be 4/0, 40.
Yeah.
And so it's just bigger, like a bigger wire than 0 is 00, and then 000 and 0000.
4/0's the biggest, isn't it?
Well, no, but it is the biggest that uses that kind of terminology. You can get bigger wire than 4/0, but then they start usually referring to it in square millimeters. There are different ways of referring to it. The rest of the world, other than America, typically refers to this as square millimeters. So it
Go
makes
figure.
a lot more sense. But yeah, America is always a little bit weird as far as measurements.
Everything.
Yeah, everything, right? Yep. Today, most solar panels incorporate MC1s, 2s, 3s, or 4 connectors.
4.
Yeah,
MC4.
MC4s. And MC4 is a trade name, sort of like Kleenex or Xerox, but we just refer to all of those type connectors as MC4. But you may see them referred to as something else, like Tyco 4 connectors or something, but they'll usually say MC4 type connector. So it's the same thing. Silicon works well as a material from which to construct solar cells because it's doped, it's an N-type material, it's an excellent conductor, or it's a semiconductor.
So a semiconductor.
Yeah, Silicon Valley, right? Semiconductors. And I was just reading some things about perovskite, and we may be in the not too distant future dealing with solar panels that are no longer made of silicon. That's the industry standard at the moment, but perovskite is definitely an up-and-comer and has some super advantages.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So is the panels that they use in space, I know space and Earth-based are completely different. Aren't they made with gold? Isn't that what they're used up there? And they're extremely more efficient?
Yeah, well, typically the gold in those is going to be, you're breaking up a little bit, but in the wiring, the wires for those would be gold because they're a better superconductor as opposed to copper. But
Do they use something different besides silicone?
you know, I don't know for sure that they do, because silicon has been the most efficient. So my guess is they would probably send up silicon, but there are thin film technologies, and I could see an advantage of shipping it up in the payload because you could roll them up, you know, they could be a little more flexible. But I'm not that sure on those. But I do know that they will use gold as the conductors on them, just because that is a more efficient. And if you think about it, space is a really good place for solar because cold and
You ain't got to take the fuel.
yeah, and it's sunny all the time. You know, there's an interesting website that NASA will direct you occasionally. And I just happened to catch it by chance. I was outside looking at the sky at night, and all of a sudden there was a huge flash of bright light. And what it was the space station that was going by turned its solar panels, and you know, you get a flare, the sun catching it and flaring on Earth. So you can see that. They have a place that'll tell you where you can see it. So it's pretty cool. And I was just reading a book talking about space-based solar, where what they're looking for is concentrating solar in space and then converting the energy into microwave energy and then beaming it to collectors down on Earth and then retransmitting that into energy. And to my way of thinking, that seemed like nonsense because the sun already transmits energy to Earth. Why bother with a whole space-based system? But they were pointing out the military applications of this. So we may see that technology develop, not because it makes any technology sense, but because it would be a way of getting energy directed towards mobile armies and forwarding positions where you could focus energy 24/7 to a receiver, to some sort of combat. Of course, all the soldiers will die of microwave radiation or whatever, but you know, who cares? That's
Plus, all that R&D money's got to go somewhere.
yeah, and that's
Yeah.
really the thing. They want, and who knows? It may evolve into something with a practical application, but I think I'd stay away from it. I would rather get into figuring out how to expand collection outside of the visible light spectrum. When we talk about the multi-dimensional thin film, multi-layer thin film, there are applications now where you can collect energy into the ultraviolet and the infrared, which is outside of the visible light spectrum. So if you're collecting ultraviolet radiation and turning it into power, well, then cloud cover is no longer an issue. You could be collecting, you know, all day long. And if you're expanding it out into the X-ray or gamma radiation belt, then nighttime is no longer an issue. So then you could be dealing with 24/7. So I just think that's a better application than, you know, sending microwave systems into outer space. Okay, what technology within inverters is generally used today to closely mimic utility power and avoids problems with sensitive electronic devices? Okay,
Pure sine wave.
pure sine wave, that's right. So pure sine wave is an analog signal, you know, like a sine wave. I know in the screen we talk about the original inverter basically turned DC current, which is a flat line, into AC current. So basically what we would get is if we wanted to change, let me clear that. So if we have a DC current here, we want to change it into a sine wave, which would be more like if this is, let's say this is 12 volts, and this is 0 volts, and this is minus 12. So a 12 volt DC current would look like that. But a 12 volt AC current would look something more like this. And these cycles, we get 60 of them per second or 60 hertz. So how do we go from this line to this line? Well, what they decided is you could just simply reverse the polarity. So if you've got positive 12 volts, then you reverse the polarity and you go to negative 12 volts. And then positive 12 volts and negative 12 volts. And you just simply do that 12 times or 60 times a second, and then that would be square wave. So you've created a square wave form, which kind of mimics, but not really. So what they found though is that this dirty power would cause ghost images on televisions, static on audio devices. You know, I wouldn't want to run my kidney dialysis machine on something like that. So, you know, it was okay for some loads, not good for others. So then they learned that if they step it up, you know, in stages, they could better emulate sine wave. Still not perfect. Well, this was referred to as a modified sine wave. Okay. Well, it still had some problems, but it was better. And then they, of course, pure sine wave is the best. Well, you don't see square wave anymore because the only reason for going with square wave is it was cheaper. But modified sine wave technology has gotten to the point where you can go down to Harbor Freight and for 19 bucks, you can buy a little inverter that's modified sine wave. So there's no reason to ever go to square wave. But pure sine wave is always the best, and that will be an analog signal. But pure sine wave can be very expensive. For instance, if you had a 2 kW inverter, a modified sine wave, you might be able to buy that for, let's say, 500 bucks for modified, but it might be $2,000 for pure. And often you'll see these referred to as modified and pure. And they're really just talking about the sine wave of the inverter. So pure sine wave is always better. Which of the following wire insulation is rated for outdoor wet conditions and is an acceptable alternative to PV wire? And it's used to, right? Underground.
Used to.
Yeah, underground service entrance -2. And the only reason I mention this is because in the National Electrical Code, they basically say that the PV source circuit, the wire that goes from the panel to the combiner box or the junction box, must be either PV wire or used to wire. And so it is rated for outdoor wet conditions. Which of the following is not a factor that will affect the performance of a solar cell? Band gap energy characteristics, the internal load resistance, size of the cell, or its amp hour capacity?
Amp hours?
Yeah, solar panels only have amps, right? They only generate power. They don't generate energy. So energy is power over time. So amp hour is a rating for batteries. Amps would be for power, for panels. And so there is no stored power in a solar panel. If you set that panel out in the sun, it doesn't just, store up energy. It either generates it or it doesn't, but it's only generating power. Which of the following can carry the greatest current of these 4 wires? Gonna wait you guys out. Everybody's snoozing. The bigger the wire, the more amps.
0.
0.
Yeah, 0 gauge can carry bigger wire or more amps. When selecting the appropriate wire gauge, which of the following is of greatest concern? The price, its ampacity rating, its resistance rating, or its voltage rating?
Capacity.
Yeah, the ampacity rating, and the reason for that is that's a life safety thing. If you exceed the ampacity rating, then your battery or your wire could burn up. It could catch on fire and burn up. Price is an issue, yeah, but that's economic. Resistance, if you have greater resistance, it's not going to burn up. It's just going to lose some of the power, which is an economic thing. Voltage rating, okay, it's going to leak some of the voltage. It's going to lose some of the power. So again, that would be an economic thing. Unless it's too much voltage, then you might get shocked. Which of the following components within a PV system is typically not considered part of the balance of systems?
Panel.
Yeah, within our terminology-wide, we refer to the panels, the inverters, and then everything else. And everything else is considered the balance of systems. And then we usually further subdivide that into the electrical balance of systems and the structural balance of systems. So electrical balance of system might be the wire, the conduit, the disconnects, whereas structural might be the racking, any trenches that you're digging, anything like that that's a support system. So those are, again, you're learning a new language through here. Which of the following is not a widely available PV type cell on the market?
Bicrystalline.
Yeah, I just made that one up. You've got monocrystalline, you've got polycrystalline, and then amorphous is a thin film. It's a different, it's not a crystalline, it's not a silicon based. A battery C rating of C20 means at that rate of discharge, the battery will drain in 20 minutes. At that rate of charge, it will take 20 hours to charge. At that rate of discharge, it'll take 20 hours to drain the battery. Or at the current rate of discharge, optimum capacity will be reached at a 20% depth of discharge.
Charge 20 hours.
It's a at that rate of charge, no, it's actually a discharging rate. So from full to empty, it will take 20 hours to drain the battery. So that's a way of comparing apples to apples on the batteries. A battery bank with a capacity of 600 amp hours will provide 20 amps of power for 600 hours. Will provide 20 amps of power for 15 hours to a 50% depth of discharge. Provide 10 amps of power for 15 hours to a 20% depth of discharge, or provide 600 continuous amps 24 hours a day.
%.
B, does everybody see how you get that? If you think about amp hours is amps times hours, or amp hours is, watt hours is amp hours times volts. So what we're getting is providing 20 amps of power for 15 hours. Well, 20 times 15 is 300 amp hours. And that's 50% of the capacity of a 600 amp hour battery bank, right? So the answer is B, because 50% depth of discharge, you don't want to use the full 600 amp hours that's available, because then the batteries will last much less long, because you're draining it almost empty each time you use it. And that causes sulfation, which then causes the battery to wear out faster. So usually with standalone systems, we're going to end up setting the depth of discharge to somewhere around 50% for lead acid batteries. Well,
So Jay,
yeah.
Jay, I have a quick question. How big of a battery is a 600 amp hour? I mean, size, physical size.
Yeah,
Say
well,
it's a lead acid battery.
yeah, a deep cycle battery that's 12 volts, that's about the size of a battery you'd find in your car, would be about 120 amp hours.
Okay.
So a 600 amp hour battery that's 12 volts would be what, 4 or 5 times the size of a battery in your car. Now, if it were 2 volts, not 12 volts, it'd probably be about the same size as a car battery. So batteries come in all sorts of different sizes and flavors. And some of the batteries that are used in systems require a forklift, to pick them up and move them. So these batteries can be pretty substantial.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, that's one of the good advantages of a lithium ion battery. Like a Tesla Powerwall, well, that's going to be a 48 volt system. I forget how many amp hours. Well, what would 13,000 watt hours divided by 48 volts? So whatever that ends up being, it sounds like, what, 260 amp hours? Is that right? 50 times that would be 13,000. So that weighs about 300 pounds, a Tesla Powerwall. So not something that you're going to just sort of pick up and hang on your wall with a molly bolt or something like that. So they can be pretty awkward and substantial. In fact, in the battery safety thing, one of the bigger issues in dealing with batteries is basically people get injured, not because they explode, not because, hydrogen gas or whatever. It's mostly that they just hurt their back trying to move them around. You know, they lift them up badly, pick them up in an awkward way, drop them on their foot. You know, that's how most battery injuries happen. All right, if the wire of an ampacity rating is 70 amps and it's placed in a conduit with 14 other similar conductors, it would have an ampacity rating of what? So we look at this chart. So we're basically having 15 conductors, and here it says between 10 and 20, it's got to be derated by 50%. So if that wire was able to carry 70 amps, it can now only safely carry 35 amps. Okay, so the amount of energy, the amount of amps going through the wire didn't change, but you have to use a wire bigger to safely carry that same amount of amps. So this would be a derating based on conduit capacity. So that's one of the things you have to derate your wires for. Another one would be heat. You know, this is basically a heat issue too, because the more wires in a conduit, the more heat they're going to generate. Because any energy that's lost, and energy is lost over distance due to resistance, that electrical energy, it's one of the laws of thermodynamics. Energy never never is created or destroyed. It simply changes form. Well, in this case, it's going to change from electricity to heat. And that conduit is an enclosed space, so it's going to get hotter and hotter and hotter. So that you have to derate your wire based on that heat that's generated from conduit fill. Does that make sense to everybody? A charge controller handles the various stages of charging within deep cycle batteries. These stages typically include bulk absorption float, full tapering leveling, equalization absorption float, or equalization leveling and absorption.
First one.
The first one, bulk absorption float. So the way that works is, let's say in the morning, you've got a standalone system. Your batteries have been providing all the energy that you have available to you overnight. So when the day starts, you're going to be at your lowest level or at the lowest portion of the cycle, and then the sun comes out. So the sun comes out and all of the power from the array is going to be dumped into the battery. That's known as bulk charging. Everything's going in, and that's how we would think it always happens all the time, but it doesn't. Because then once you reach a preset point, which is usually going to be around 90%, then your charge controller starts to vary the pulse width. You can think about it like if you're flipping on and off a light switch. And if it's on for 10 beats and then off for 0, that would be bulk charging. But then it would be on for 9, off for 1, then on for 8, off for 2, and so on. So you're varying the width. And what that's doing under the absorption portion of the charge, excuse me, would be kind of applying the brakes. So it's not full on and then full off. During absorption, it's going to just taper it off. So that's the pulse width. By varying the pulse width, it slows down the charging. Then once the battery reaches 100%, it goes into float mode. So you use a little bit of power, you replace a little bit of power. Use the power, replace the power. And it's going to do that the rest of the day while the sun is shining. Then when the sun goes down, now the batteries are going to start cycling down again. And then the next morning you start the whole thing all over again. So those are the 3 levels of absorption, bulk, or bulk absorption float. And that's a more efficient way of charging than the old way of charging, which was a series charge, which acted a lot like a thermostat. So basically the way a series charge controller worked is it would measure the voltage of the battery. And when it reached a certain low point, let's say, 12.6 volts, then it would dump all the power into the battery that was available from the array. until those batteries reached, say, 13.8 volts, then it would shut off. And no power from the array would go in till the battery had drained back down to 12.6. Just like the thermostat on your heater works. You know, when it hits a certain temperature, it turns on. When it reaches a certain temperature, it turns off. Nothing happens until it lowers the temperature and then it turns on. So there was a lot of inefficiency into that series. So pulse width modulation charge controllers use this format. And pretty much every charge controller on the market today is going to be a pulse width modulation. And this charge controller, like right here behind me, it's an Outback. It's going to be a pulse width modulation system. Okay, the place where multiple strings from an array are connected in parallel is referred to as, it's what Corey and I were talking about early on.
Junction box.
Junction box, actually it will be a combiner box because we're making a parallel connection. A junction box is just a pass-through. So you're not actually combining the wires in parallel. You're just simply transitioning from one wire to another, but you're still keeping the strings separate. They could be exactly the same thing. It's just what's happening inside the box that matters. And a combiner box is nothing more than a glorified wire nut.
For our system,
Pardon?
for our system, we just use junction box, use minor box, and we just had to run those extra strings down the conduit through the house. Is there a reason you'd want to use a combiner box or not? Is it just so you can add amps, or is it to make it easier to get wire down through a conduit?
Yeah, the combiner box is really a wire management thing, so that you would then be running a larger wire, but only two wires, you know, a positive and negative, from the box up on the roof all the way down to your DC disconnect and then into your inverter. But you lose the ability to individually control those strings when you do that. So in today's environment, we typically run multiple strings through the same combiner or through the same conduit so that you have multiple MPPT tracking, you know, handled in the inverter. So that's why. But the early on systems almost always used combiner boxes. And it was really just to avoid having to run 6 pairs of wires or 3 pairs of wires or whatever. You could combine them all into one pair of wires. When selecting a standalone inverter, all the following specifications are important except
Anti-islanding.
yeah, anti-islanding, right? We don't care about that because we're not connected to the grid in a standalone system. The nominal voltage we care about, the power rating, and the inverter efficiency. Those are all important. Anti-islanding is not. Older charge controllers used a thermostat type controller known as a series. Today, most charge controllers are, as we were just saying, pulse width modulation. So don't get that confused. Almost all charge controllers are going to be pulse width modulation. This is just to give you an example of reading the chart that's in the National Electrical Code. But a number 4 AWG TW copper conductor, or a number 4 gauge TW copper conductor, has an ampacity of. Well, you look in the first column, you find 4. Then you need to find which column TW is, and that's in the first column. So we come over, and it's going to be 70 amps. If we had been looking at PV wire, number 4, it would have been 95 amps. So we just say 70 amps. And that's going to be the correct one. We'll let that catch up. One important thing, though, as you're sizing wire, if you wanted to, you know, figure out what size wire you need, let's say we wanted to run 70 amps through our system and we're using PV wire, we might look here and say at 6 gauge, we can go to 75 amps. So you'd say, okay, I'll just use 6 gauge wire. And that would make logical sense. But what you'll need to know is what is the termination rating on both sides of that wire, the pieces of equipment that you're connecting that wire to. So if that wire is going from, say, your junction box to your DC disconnect, then in order for me to use 6 gauge wire, I would have to know that the junction box I'm using is rated for high temperature 90-degree connections, and that the DC disconnect I'm using is rated for high temperature 90-degree connections. If I don't know that, then I have to assume the worst and draw from column 1. So just to be safe, because you don't necessarily know what equipment is being connected when you're sizing the wire, or you may swap out that equipment in the future, you should make it a habit of always just looking at column 1 to select the ampacity rating of your wire. So even though you're using a high temperature wire, still size it as if you were using a low temperature wire, because you don't know what those terminal ratings are going to be. And that's something that people, even very experienced installers, get messed up with when they're out in the field sizing this stuff. Okay, which of the following will help minimize system damage in the event of a lightning strike? Surge protection, fuse and breakers, ground fault detection, or all of the above? It's going to be surge.
Surge
Right.
protection.
Okay, fuses and breakers don't help you in a lightning strike because they don't react fast enough. Otherwise, you know, you'd never have damage in your house from a lightning strike. And ground fault detection just tells you there's a problem. It doesn't actually fix anything. So you need to add surge protection into the system. So that's what's going to protect you from lightning. So there's a lot of stuff in chapter 5. I would suggest, if you haven't felt like you've really looked through it and gotten everything done, this week, because chapter 5 is such a big chapter, we're really just focusing on that. So by Thursday, we'll do a review of chapter 4 and chapter 5. So by the end of this week, you should feel comfortable with 1 through 5, all of the chapters. You should have gone through all of the labs that are in the system, and then you'll be totally caught up. So any questions before we call it a day? No? Okay, well, if you have an individual question, just send me an email, and then I'll see you guys on Thursday. All right,
Thank
Thank you, Jay.
bye-bye.